Thank you very much. Yes, I'm very much not the Hannah that's written the book. I don't want to be confused for that Hannah. And I'm so delighted to be sharing the stage with her because it's a guaranteed no-nonsense conversation where you sort of absolutely separate the fact from the fiction and go away armed with the really crucial information in this, well, fight against climate change, but ultimately feeling hopeful and that things are much more doable than you might imagine. I'm going to just start off by asking, because I'm sure everybody will be getting their copy, and I highly recommend you do as well. But can you just explain your structure, your thinking behind the 50 questions and the answers, the way you've done that?
Yeah, so my background is environmental science. I talk about it all the time. I write about it all the time. I released a book last year looking at much broader than climate, but 7 big environmental problems. And climate was just one chapter in that. And what I found when doing events like this, or interviews or podcasts, is that people had many more questions specifically on the climate part of this and specifically on solutions. So lots of people that were engaged but had further questions about costs, about mining impact, about trade-offs on these solutions, whether they work. And actually, this book is really a follow-up, like taking the 50 most common questions I get asked on this and try to very succinctly, in a few pages, give a relatively concrete and kind of data, evidence-driven answer on what actually just is the answer to this question, and how, importantly, how do we put this in context when we're fed so much conflicting information.
I mean, there are very few people who could do it as succinctly as you do. I was just kind of amazed all the way through that you could take 50 questions like that and answer them in that way. And then there's also extra things to think about for those who want to dive a little bit deeper, which is irresistible once you're reading. I don't think anyone's going to pass over those moments.
It was an optional skip. But yeah,
an optional skip. And I noticed the font is a tiny bit smaller, so you have to be a little bit more committed. But you say, at the heart of every answer, as you've just alluded to, is data. But can you just explain, I know data is an obvious thing, but the way you use that, the sorts of numbers that you're crunching, where you're looking for your information to make sure it's not misleading and countering the sorts of things out there that are giving people the wrong ideas.
Yeah, so I think I'm biased as a data scientist, and I work with data all the time, that I think data is really important. But I actually think when it comes to understanding climate solutions, or the climate problem more broadly, I think data can also do a lot of damage. And I actually think that's because we put so much emphasis on the kind of authority of having a number that as soon as there's a headline or a news article or some piece of information that has a number in it, we automatically take that as gospel. And the challenge there is that you can basically present a number, but without any context for what that number means. Is that big? Is that small? How does that compare to something else? That data in itself is actually relatively useless, but people put a lot of emphasis on it and a lot of authority on it because there's a number there. So a key part of this is, yes, taking numbers we'll often hear, but trying to put the context around them so people can understand, is this a big deal? Is it not? Is that expensive? Is it not? So the context around the number is so crucial, which is what I try to do.
Yeah, I mean, before we go on with that, because there's lots of dots, I think, about why so much out there is missing the context. I feel like the book is really an answer or a message to counter a feeling that lots of people have about climate change. So I just want to gauge from everyone in the room, who feels optimistic for the future when it comes to our planet and climate change? Okay. Who feels the total antithesis, worried, doom, Armageddon, fear sense? Or yeah. I mean, that is the quite significant majority. But we are at the conduit, and I feel like there's more optimism here than there might be out there. But the general feeling that you describe that's out there is one of, I suppose, helplessness. I mean, just to get your thoughts on that. For the person who sort of immediately felt positive, as you did, would you say why? What makes you feel optimistic?
Carbon intensity is generation of energy is curving down. So therefore, carbon intensity of energy generation is curving down already. So therefore, if we continue to produce more energy over time you'll have less intensity, and eventually you'll actually have less carbon production, which is a theme that Hannah talks about quite a bit.
Yeah, and people don't know that.
Yeah, I think most people don't know that. I think most people have this sense that we've not made any progress at all on climate. And I think part of this is driven by the fact that the kind of key metric that people focus on, which is ultimately the most important metric, but the key metric is, basically CO2 emissions or temperature, right? And that's the stuff we need to get right. We need to drive global CO2 emissions down, right? But people just see that it's not dropping and therefore assume all of our efforts have been pointless, we haven't made any progress forward. And I think what's really, really key is to understand that to get to the point where you start to drive emissions down, there's lots of steps you need to do along the way, right? So a really key step for us, we need to move away from fossil fuels, right? That's how we solve climate change, right? A key part of that is having alternatives to fossil fuels that are available and work and are cheap enough and cost competitive with fossil fuels, and then people need to deploy them, right? And once you do all that, then you start to get the emissions reductions, right? We're at the point where 10 years ago, we didn't have any of the kind of fingers there, right? Now we've got available solutions, they're getting increasingly cheap, they're cost competitive, they're starting to be deployed at huge, huge rates, and then that then filters through into the emissions reductions. But if you only look at the final step, which to be clear is the most important step, then you get the sense that nothing has happened, and actually we've done a ton of if you think about this like a marathon, we've done now all the training, and now we need to start running the marathon, and it is a marathon, but now we're at the starting line and we can actually do stuff and move forward.
I mean, it's fascinating, the 10-year thing. And you say one of the reasons so much data out there is wrong or misused is because it's so quickly out of date, because we are moving so incredibly fast.
Yeah, I think on a range of metrics, I think if you're looking at data that's more than a few years old, you're really behind the curve on what's happening. Like just a few examples, maybe I can take a poll in the room, right? So in 2020, 6% of China's new cars were electric. Who thinks that in the last year that was more than 40%? It's more than 50%, right? But if you're taking data from even a few years ago, you're off by 30 or 40 percentage points. And that's what a lot of people do, or they see, or as in a media report, or is used as a kind of sense that nothing has happened or nothing is changing. And actually stuff is changing very, very quickly. But again, if you're looking at things from a few years ago, you're way, way off. It's very, very common for the kind of technologies that we need. So solar panels or batteries. I think people underestimate one, the cost reductions and how quickly that's happened, but also how far these technologies have progressed, even in terms of the minerals that we need to use, right? So a solar panel, the amount of silicon you need, the amount of silver you need, all those components is vastly lower than creating the same solar panel even just 5 years ago, which means that the amount of mining and stuff we need to do for this energy transition is vastly lower than if you were just taking the numbers from 5 years ago. So this stuff is changing really quickly, and it's actually very, very hard to keep up.
Yeah. I mean, those people who put up their hands to say they were more on the doom and gloom side might already be feeling optimistic because Hannah's so infectious with those statistics. But if you still can remember why you felt bleak, does anyone want to offer up why they feel that way? Yeah.
Trump's impact.
Yeah, well, I definitely was going to come on to that.
That's what everyone.
Yeah, I mean, can I? It's a really good point that quite often in the book there are these reasons to be optimistic, and things that have happened, huge amounts of progress in such a short amount of time, and then you sort of say, but what happens now? We have Trump in power, undoing so much of the good, and with so much power in such an enormous place that has such an impact.
So I get this question a lot, what about Trump? And I think the story there is, yes, Trump will set the US back by a few years in his basically his dismantling of and blocking of renewable energy and electric vehicles and all of the stuff that we need to transition. There's no doubt about that. Domestically, the US will be set back in time. When you look at it at a global level, I think the impacts will be less than people imagine. And that's because there are just many other countries now that are just going full steam ahead. And by countries, I mean China. And I think actually China will actually just take this as an opportunity of the US stepping back to basically just then monopolize this energy transition that we're going through. This kind of, some people frame it as a kind of electrotech revolution. So we had the industrial revolution, we've had the digital revolution. A kind of key transition the world is now going through is moving to more sustainable sources of energy and electrifying our energy systems, which comes with huge efficiency benefits that we can discuss. So there's this kind of new revolution bubbling up, and there are countries like China and some others that are seeing this and taking advantage of it and wanting to really own this. And there are countries like the US which are stepping back and basically relying on the world reverting back to kind of 20th century technologies. And I think in the end, the US is not going to win that battle. There was actually just a couple of analyses came out today, actually, looking at what Trump's impact on kind of the global emissions curve and stuff would be. And the kind of outcome was kind of probably not that much. And that's because the US wasn't doing a ton on wasn't decarbonizing that quickly in the first place. Emissions were going down, yes, but it was way behind Europe. It wasn't really catalyzing many of the kind of low carbon technologies that we now need to transition to. So I think in some sense, the US is basically just kind of hurting itself in some way. And I think it will start to get back on course in the future, but it will just be behind. And I think it's kind of handicapping itself. Its impact on global emissions maybe is minor over the long term, but I don't think it's quite as dramatic as we might assume.
Okay. Well, there we go. More good things to know. And I feel that you and Trump, bear with me, have one thing in common. Just bear with me. As my segue onto this, but it's a huge part of the book, which is a distrust of the media. And I feel that this book, so much of it is addressed to people. What can we do? But so much of it seems to be saying, be really careful what you read, how you read it, what you look at, images. I mean, is this all media? How can we get information if not from the media? And is some better than others? I know that you are a fan of The Economist, for example.
Yeah, it's definitely not all media, and it's not all journalists, and lots of journalists want to do a good job. Part of it, like, I also just have sympathy for the position that some media outlets and journalists are in, right? I've had discussions in the past. It's very awkward when you're critical of the media and then a book comes out and you have to speak to all the media.
Suddenly we're friends.
Yeah, but I've spoken to journalists about this, and some of their response has been, and my point to them was, you go for the clickbaity kind of extremist headline, either in one direction or the other, right? And you miss a lot of the kind of nuance of this, right? And the kind of, their response was, yeah, we've tried some of the nuanced stuff, but then no one clicks on it and no one reads it. So I actually think, yes, I'm critical of the media, but there is just this unfortunate feedback loop where, in some sense, the media produces information or content that we click on and part of us wants to read and is more intrigued by. But then that means we get fed kind of incomplete information or actually just wrong information. And then we get in this kind of feedback loop, which I think is unfortunate and it's not good to develop a good information ecosystem. So I think that's a challenge. I think a key challenge is this context setting. As I said, I think it's very common in the media to just present a number with zero context. And if it's very, very hard then for people to make sense of this, like the example I often use is that you should always try to question, is this a big number? Right? Because as humans, anything over 1,000 is a big number, right? So as soon as you see an article that says millions, billions, even trillions, you think, oh my God, that's enormous. Whether you're talking about investment cost or the amount we need to mine or any of these land use. And the challenge there is that we automatically think that's a big number. And where I think the media is failing in many ways is giving people the kind of expertise and context they need to understand how people should think about this and how they get some sense of perspective.
I mean, you share near the end your 5, I think it is, tips for basically how to. I'm remembering what you what you call them, yes, how to immunize yourself from misleading claims. I mean, that's one of them with big numbers, but perhaps you could tell us some of the others so that, you know, what you arm yourself with when you're reading.
Yeah, so I tried, like, I do climate stuff and environment stuff mostly, so I'm maybe less kind of vulnerable to misinformation in that domain, but like obviously it applies to me in areas I have no expertise in whatsoever, and I can trip up and fall down a kind of rabbit hole. So I think it occurs more broadly outside of climate. But the first one is, you know, don't look at an image or a photograph and think that that gives you any sense of context for what's going on, right? A very common example here is you'll see people will just share a picture of wind turbine blades in a field. And then, of course, there's a huge blow-up on social media of like, how can you say that wind energy is sustainable? Look at all this waste. Of course, if you put into context, the waste that's generated from wind energy is vastly lower than coal, like orders of magnitude lower. But if you just look at the picture, it just looks incredibly bad, right? So don't look at pictures, try to find some numbers about it. Ask, is that a big number? Like, try to get a sense of scale. One question is, like, compared to what? Right? Like, I think this is often a challenge when we're talking about climate solutions, and I frame it as kind of this kind of perfect solutionism, where we're often looking for this perfect solution that requires no land, no mining, like comes with no impact whatsoever. And the reality is, if that's what we're going to wait for, then we'll just stick with the system that we have, because those solutions just don't exist, right? So doing this comparison of, you know, I don't know, the land use of a solar panel compared to zero land use doesn't make sense, because we need some energy and we need some solar panels, right? Yeah. The more appropriate comparison is, how does that compare to the impact of the current system, which is predominantly fossil fuels, right? So to get a sense of like, what is the most appropriate thing to compare this to, don't compare it to zero, right? How old is the data? Like, we've just discussed this, like, question, you know, is this recent data? Is this data from 2015? If so, that you're really, really vastly out of date. And the last one is, like, how can this change in the future? I think the kind of exciting thing about these climate solutions is that many of them are still extremely early in their journey, right? If you look at, you know, we've had centuries to, you know, optimize fossil fuels and optimize a fossil fuel system. Kind of these technologies are basically just coming now, or aren't even here yet, right? So there's huge of scope for these solutions to improve. So in some sense, the kind of optimistic message is like, this is the worst these solutions are ever going to be, and they're only going to get better from here. So think about how will this actually change in the future, because it won't stay as it is today.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I found really interesting, sort of, I think, alongside that perfect solutionism, is you can consider yourself, and I think you say you fall into the trap a little bit as well, an environmentalist, or you feel like you care, but there's some innate sense that actually you don't really think the answer can be in building, in progress, and you said this, I mean, your words, a growing tension between traditional environmentalism and what needs to be done to solve climate change, the dilemma environmentalists, including yourself, are wrestling with. It's always been about blocking and delaying, and action now is just all about building and accelerating. And all the way through the book, there's this reminder that you have to build, forget, you know, planning permissions, and sort of you're really all for ripping all of that up.
We still need planning permissions,
yeah.
But like I think this is a tension, and it does require some mindset shift.
Yeah, I really
where
felt,
kind of traditional environmentalism, of which I have been a part of, like has this very strong conservation lens, right? And actually, some of the biggest climate successes to date have been, you know, blocking the new big gas pipeline, or, you know, trying to stop the new coal plant that's about to be built. As it has been, the successes have been about stopping bad stuff from being built or happening. And the mindset shift is like just the reality is that the world is just going to need to build a lot of low carbon energy infrastructure. We're going to need to build wind farms and solar farms and batteries, and so there's a whole amount of stuff that we now need to build, and that just is a kind of inherent tension for a kind of environmentalist often, that like historically it's about doing less and blocking stuff, and now it's about doing more of the good stuff and building stuff, and I think that's just an inherent tension that's difficult to navigate.
Yeah, and that's why I think perhaps you chose to quite latterly include a chapter about AI, for instance. Like, again, there's quite a lot of worry out there, but it feels like where sort of emerging technologies and AI is concerned, despite the carbon use of them, we need to be more optimistic about what it can do.
So I think there are lots of reasons to be concerned about AI. I'm concerned about AI for a variety of reasons. I actually think the carbon energy part of this is quite low on the list. And I think maybe let's take a poll of the room, right? So actually, so not just AI, but like data centers as a whole. Who thinks that the share of global electricity used for data centers is more than 5%? Okay. So it's 1.5%, right? So that's all of data centers, and AI is a very small fraction of that at the moment. So AI as a whole is probably like less than 0.5% of the world's electricity, right? And I think if you ask most people on the street about that, they would, again, vastly overestimate how much electricity and how much carbon is used for AI. And I get this question a lot from people of, like, not just AI in general, but like their individual use of AI, right? So their individual use of chatbots, for example, so the kind of ChatGPT, LLM. And I think a lot of people hyper-focus on this, and in some sense, there's a bit of a kind of scorning of it, right? You kind of feel this inherent, like, oh, am I a bad environmentalist because I've asked ChatGPT a question? But the energy use of asking ChatGPT a question is so impossibly small. Like, you would need to ask ChatGPT like 100 to 1,000 questions to even increase your carbon emissions by 1%, right? And no one is asking ChatGPT 1,000 questions, right? And I think my point is not that like we should just build as many data centers as we can, and we shouldn't care about AI, and we shouldn't care about trying to improve the efficiency. But like I get concerned that there's 99.9% of emissions going on there, and we're all like, oh, let's look at the 0.1% that's coming from AI because it's the new form of emissions, and we kind of forget about the big stuff that is the other 99.9%. So I have some concerns about kind of misplaced focus, and so much focus is going on AI when at the moment it's not a huge contributor.
But I should more focus beyond what it can do, the potential for change and for climate solutions.
Yeah, I think there's a positive and negative. Like, it's undeniable that I think energy use for AI will just go up, right? And its emissions in some sense will go up for some period. But there is also the flip side where there is potential for AI to help us in many ways, right? So the International Energy Agency, for example, projects that by 2030, actually the energy savings from using AI to optimize energy systems, to run our grids more efficiently, to balance loads, which is a huge part of this energy transition, well, actually, the energy reductions from that will more than offset the increase in actual energy use for powering the AI itself, right? And you can debate what that kind of balance looks like, but that's kind of the kind of potential there for kind of optimization. There's also just huge benefits. Like, a really exciting one is the use of AI for like weather forecasting and climate modeling, where like a very recent example was that the Indian monsoon can be very complex, right? And it's quite unpredictable, but it has a huge impact especially for Indian farmers, right? The timing of the monsoon, when it comes, the intensity, has huge impacts for when they plant, what crops to plant, so it's kind of hard for them to navigate. And this year they had an AI model run and many other kind of AI-powered models run. And the AI model got it right and the other ones got it wrong, right? There was this like very unpredictable pause. So the monsoon started, and then there was kind of a 2 or 3 week lag where it stopped, and there was basically no rain. And for a farmer, that's terrible. If you've planted your crops expecting rain and then no rain comes, that's really, really bad. But they basically sent out information to the farmers on their mobile phones, like this is what, and lots of farmers changed behaviors, like they delayed the planting or they chose a different crop. And the AI model was the only one that actually got that correct, right? So there's potential there. There's other things like finding mineral resources we need. So there's lots of opportunities for AI, I think, as well. And it is that balance of, yes, energy use will increase, but how do we also make the most of AI? Because we're not going to stop AI, but so we need to, in some sense, make the most of it in terms of helping with climate solutions as well.
One other thing, or there are so many things I sort of would want to potentially to put to the audience, but one other question I'd be really interested to see is your question about this is a very polarized debate, essentially, or it's a very polarized issue, because it's not a debate. Do you think it is a very polarized issue? Yes, put your hand up for yes. Is this very polarized? I mean, okay, so that, like, is it?
I think in the political rhetoric, it's very polarized. And that's obviously true in the US. It's increasingly true in the UK. Like, I think the UK kind of party leaders, they're very much diverging and actually playing a lot on the kind of polarized rhetoric of climate change. If you actually ask the public, though, I don't think it's as polarized as people might assume it to be, right? So there's lots of survey data on this. If you ask people in every country in the world, the majority of people say that climate change exists and humans are driving it and it's an issue and they want to see more action. And the majority in every country says that. Obviously not everyone, right? There are people that just don't believe in climate change and will block it at all costs. But the majority in every country does care about climate change in some sense and wants to see action on it. That's even true in the US. So if you look at polarization data, the US is by far the most polarized. But even in the US, you still have the majority of people there that support climate action. When you look at below a level below, so not just looking at, do people care about climate change, but do people in general like clean energy or want to see more clean energy? That's even less polarizing, right? So the interesting thing about the US is that it's polarized there, and Republicans in general are much less enthusiastic about climate or addressing climate. But actually, if you look at where clean power has been built the fastest, it's been in very red, very Republican states, right? And that's not because they want to necessarily care about climate change and want to fix it. It's just because there are also other co-benefits to deploying clean energy. Like, local air pollution is often a bigger motivator for some people than climate change, because it's a kind of local issue. You can immediately see the impacts, which is not necessarily the case for climate. There's also just kind of energy security, economic reasons to do this stuff. Like, a lot of the kind of red states, they kind of fall in this very, very windy kind of wind belt of the US. So there, if you have a landowner in, Texas or kind of a very red state, they can just earn more income by putting some wind turbines there. And if you offer them that, a lot of them will just say yes, right? And often, actually, the regulations there have been, coming back to the kind of planning permission stuff, have been less restrictive than in some blue states, which have actually allowed red states to build this stuff more quickly. Yeah. So even when the kind of climate part of it is very polarizing, there are actually ways that you can also drive climate action by focusing less on the climate angle and more on the co-benefits of the energy transition angle.
I mean, it's so interesting. I found that that's such an interesting question answered, because does it matter, why you're doing it if you're doing it, I suppose, is what that gets to.
Yeah, and in my last book, like my brother now thinks he's a celebrity because he made it into my last book. And I used him as an example of, like, my brother, it's not that he doesn't believe in climate change or he's not, like, mildly concerned about it, but he's not, like, an eco warrior. He's not thinking about it every day, like, in the way that I am. But he was the first, like, I didn't drive a car, but he was the first in my family to get an electric car. And again, he did not get an electric car because he really cares about the climate and his carbon footprint. He just got an electric car because he thought a Tesla was cool, right? But the point there is like, why does it matter why he bought the electric car? Like, he reduced his carbon emissions, and if that's the key motivator for him making that positive transition, then fantastic, I'm all for it. Like, I largely just care about the outcome, not whether someone necessarily did the pro-climate behaviour because they really care about climate change.
I mean, electric cars is a really good one to move on to because you spend a lot of time talking about them, and in a way your brother thinking that they were cool is one of the things I feel like you most really would love that message to get out there, that they're worth buying. I mean, I put the book down and thought, okay, I really need to look into this. But my question about electric cars and about so many of these exciting solutions is the cost. So for me, every time it came to something that felt exciting, my reason for not doing it was the cost. An electric car, too expensive. A heat pump, too expensive. Often for people, sustainable ways of eating, too expensive. The world is still set up so that all the exciting, climate-friendly things that you write about are not the economically viable option for people.
I think that's changing quickly. The heat pump is expensive. That's why the government offers $7,500 as a grant. Like the upfront cost, I think for many people is still prohibitive. Like it's just more expensive to install a heat pump than a gas boiler. And so that's like one area where I'm actually concerned about the kind of economic cost of that. For electric vehicles, I think that's changing really rapidly. Like, yes, 10 years ago, your electric car was much, much more expensive than a petrol car. And that gap has been closing really quickly. Especially, like, even if you actually look at second-hand markets, and actually most people don't buy a new car, they buy a used car. Electric vehicles are under, like, pick an equivalent model, and the electric car is cheaper than the petrol car. I think many people are unaware of that, which I think kind of breeds this sense that the alternatives are much, much more expensive. So that's in markets like the UK. Like the gap is really, really closing quickly, and in second-hand markets, actually equivalent electric cars are actually slightly cheaper. Look in other parts of the world, and electric cars are just obviously cheaper, right? Like China is building extremely good electric cars for $10,000. And they're not that price here, but that's a choice, right? They're not that cost here because markets like the US or markets like Europe have, in many sense, been slow to move and are now feeling threatened by the fact that China can make extremely, extremely good 10 grand cars, and we can't make extremely good 10 grand cars. So that's the challenge. But you can make a good electric car relatively cheap. And the fact that they are expensive is a choice.
Yeah, and that comes back, I think, to another big pushback, a choice, not my choice. So there's this feeling amongst a lot of people of helplessness about all these issues too. So it's not my choice. What can I do to make that cheaper, or to do so many of these things? People feel helpless as individuals because systematic change is largely beyond us, and what we do doesn't feel like it matters enough to push the dial.
Yeah, I think this is a challenge that people have. They have this sense of kind of lack of agency, which I get. But I think this is often framed as one of two extremes. Like either you have some people that are very, this is a kind of individual behavior change problem, and if we all do our bit, we'll sum that up and we'll solve the problem, right? So this kind of very individual, we all need to do our bit thing. And then there's the other extreme, which is this sense that this is purely a systemic problem. Any individual changes don't matter whatsoever. It's just the governments and the bad companies that need to change, right? And I think that's incredibly disempowering, and I actually think that's wrong. I think both extremes are wrong. Yes, individuals on their own are not going to fix this, right? Like it does take systemic change in the form of government policies, government investment, private investment, companies. So I think the role of the kind of systemic level is governments and companies making sure that there are, good, viable and available alternatives, that those alternatives are affordable for people, and the infrastructure is there to support people to make the right decision. But ultimately, as individuals, there's no point in them doing it. And of course, they won't do it if the kind of individual take on this is, well, I'm not willing to change, why should I do my bit, right? Like the example I use in the book is about electric cars, right? So we could all say it's on governments and companies to either make public transport more available, more affordable, or electric cars the same. So the government should go and implement and build like huge public charging networks and stuff. Of course they're not going to do that, and why would we expect them to do that if we all say, no, I like my petrol car, and of course I'm not going to switch to an electric car? Like, there needs to be a push and pull, right? As individuals, we need to be willing to change when those solutions are available and affordable for us. And we also need to ask governments and companies to make that happen. And so there needs to be a meeting of the middle. But I think this extreme that it's purely only systemic or purely only on individuals to change, I think both extremes is a kind of false dichotomy.
I mean, in the sense of what individuals can do, I was also quite struck by you saying in your list of certain things, don't sweat some of the small stuff. So you were saying, don't worry too much about turning all the lights off, going to the supermarket with a plastic bag. I was interested by that, but obviously then I read on the reasons. But can you explain why not sweating the small stuff you advocate?
Yeah, I mean, I think this stuff is fine to do, and I do it. Like, I always switch the lights off, and I use recycled plastic bags and stuff. But I think my concern there is that people focus on the little stuff and miss the big stuff, right? It's a bit like the AI problem we had. If your contribution to solving climate change is not asking ChatGPT some questions, sorry, that's not actually making really a difference. And there are other areas where you could put much more focus on and would make a much bigger difference. And there's a kind of psychological framing here, which is kind of called moral licensing, where once we've done a few things that we think are good, that's kind of out of our head, like, oh, I've done my bit for the environment and climate today. And then we just carry on and make decisions, often actually pretty high impact and negative direction decisions, kind of thoughtlessly, or we don't think about it because we've done our bit. And the kind of supermarket plastic bag example is a good one, where we're always very focused on taking our plastic bag to the supermarket to reduce our environmental impact, but then most people think very, very little about the stuff they're buying at the supermarket and putting in the bag, right? So And there, the difference in the magnitude of impact is astronomical, right? The carbon footprint, often of the stuff you're putting in the plastic bag, is thousands, if not tens of thousands, bigger than the carbon footprint of the plastic bag in itself. And my point is not to take your plastic bag, it's to not think that that's you done your bit because you've taken the plastic bag, but to actually think about the big stuff, of which diet is a huge one. Really think about, these are the big levers that I can pull, and think about the stuff that you're actually buying to put in the bag.
I mean, talking about that then, could we perhaps go back to where one of my third worries about the economics of what you're buying. So if you're in the supermarket and you're trying to make the climate-friendly choices about what to put in your trolley, I mean, you write a lot about new forms of meat. There are lots of reservations about that. One of those, they are expensive, but also, again, in terms of changing the mindset, you write about trying to actually flip the worries about the processing of them, because I feel like, maybe I don't know if I speak for other people, but the worries about things about beyond meat, etc., is that they're hugely processed. So people think actually they'd rather buy meat than those. But again, there's a mindset shift in that.
Yeah, I think there's been a huge rise in concerns and discussions about ultra-processed foods in general, and I think I have reservations about this very broad category of just ultra-processed, which can range from huge, vast differences in foods. And again, it's framed around a negative, and it's not the case that every food in that, very kind of undefined category has the same impact on health, right? But I think the challenge is that these meat substitute products are ultra-processed, so I think they ultimately get caught up in this kind of backlash against ultra-processed foods. And my point there is that, a can of Coca-Cola is just not nutritionally equivalent to a high-protein meat substitute burger, but they're lumped in the same category, right? They're lumped in the category of ultra-processed, and I think that's kind of incorrect and not particularly useful. But I think there has been a backlash, and I think meat substitute products have been kind of embroiled in that. But on the cost point, it's definitely the case that like for like, the kind of meat substitute products are a bit more expensive than meat. So I did analysis where I went to my Tesco, I took all the prices of all the stuff, and then I plotted them, and the meat substitute products are generally more expensive. And I think that's a challenge because first of all, just to set the scene, a huge part of our environmental footprint is diet, and the biggest thing lever you can pull on that is to move to a more plant-based diet. And that's not just for climate, that has huge spillovers for other environmental problems. Land use, biodiversity loss, water use, nitrogen pollution. Food has a huge impact on all of these issues. And eating less meat is the kind of largest lever that we have. But the challenge there is that I think many people are reserved when it comes to meat substitute products, often because they haven't necessarily tried them or haven't tried recent ones. They've actually gotten much better over the last 5 years or so, but it's unfamiliar to them, and they would never really think or would be skeptical about picking that up. That becomes even more difficult when they're more expensive than the meat. Right? There's zero incentive there for them to pick them up. I think if they are cost competitive, you get into a better playing field, or a more even playing field, where people are slightly more likely to pick up the meat substitute product. So I think getting at least the cost comparable is a really core component of that. And then I think there's a whole kind of attitudes, mindset component to this, which I think we also need to overcome. It's interesting, if you do blind taste tests with people, they actually will often prefer the meat substitute product until you unblind it and they realize they've had the meat substitute, and then they change their mind, right? So there is this kind of subconscious, they don't like the kind of synthetic, ultra-processed nature of the meat substitute product, even if actually they prefer the taste and the texture of it. So there is a kind of psychological component to this as well.
And also, as you say again and again in the book, people don't like being told what not to do, what not to have. And that's, I feel, something we all can get behind in terms of messaging in our daily life, or what we share, is people want positives. I mean, that's what this book is, but people want what they can have or what they can do, not what they can't have and what they can't do.
Yeah, I think as a general kind of communication, kind of action motivation tactic, in some sense restricting people's freedoms, or having the sense that their freedoms have been restricted, is often can be quite counterproductive, and people push back in the opposite direction. I think this is extremely true for diet. I actually think that diet is going to be the hardest part of this to change, because food is so personal for people, right? And they make these decisions 3 or 4 or more times a day, and they want complete freedom over what they put in their body, like quite rightly, what they put in their body, what they get to choose. So the sense that, you know, these these freedoms are being restricted, I think people feel very strongly. You see it very clearly in the US, and I think in some sense that's partly why the US is moving much more slowly than Europe, for example, where even when it comes to cars, like a lot of Americans, even if they would actually just pick an electric car anyway, they like the freedom to be able to pick the big gasoline SUV or the big gasoline truck. And they will not take it if you put restrictions on that and say you can't have that, right? So in some sense, it's a bit of a kind of, I don't know, political or kind of pragmatic strategy, that it's often more effective to just promote the benefits of the good stuff you want people to change to, rather than saying, no, you can't have the bad stuff.
Yeah. In a moment, I've definitely time to relinquish the mic, even though I've got so many questions, every single page for me, just amazing things to reflect on with you, but you can all read about that within the book. But I am just really interested maybe in hearing if anyone had particularly reservations, because you do dedicate a lot of time to the electric cars, and you answer every single question that someone might have as a reason not to buy one. So, I mean, are there people here who want one but feel they have a reason not to get it that isn't mine about the expense? Because Hannah will allay your fears, and I just find it really interesting the way you do that. Has anyone else heard reasons? Yeah.
My car still perfectly fine. It's a 10-year-old Mini, and I see no reason to change something that works perfectly fine yet. Until it grows, it literally does not.
Yeah. So you mean you do answer that one. So if you didn't hear, this lady said her car's perfectly fine. It's had her Mini for 10 years. Why would she change it until she needs to? But I mean, yeah, that's lots of people's reasons, I think.
Including my parents. So like, my parents don't have an electric car, and it's because my dad, he could not bear to part with something that still can run, right? If the car can run, like, how could I take this perfectly good car and send it away. So there's that.
It gets used maybe once every couple of weeks.
Okay, so that's another interesting point that you answer, yeah.
Yeah, so if you take away, I guess, the kind of sentimental, I can't throw something away, and break it down into the numbers of, like, from a climate change perspective, does it make sense to switch the car, right? So the point that always comes up about electric cars is that they basically emit more carbon to manufacture them, and that's true, right? So if you just create a petrol car, an electric car, and don't drive them, the electric car is worse for the climate, right? The key question is, how many miles do you need to drive before you pay off that debt, right? So for the average kind of UK driver, it works out at around a year and a half, right, of driving. If it's a second-hand, if the question then, that's comparing new car with new car. If you have an existing car, then you don't have the debt from the production of the, but then for the average UK driver, you're probably only extending that kind of payoff period by another year or so, right? So you're probably talking about 3 years then, right? And that's for the UK, so that's the kind of baseline. That's for a kind of average driver. If you are well below the average and you basically never drive, then mathematically it probably just doesn't make sense for you to change the car, right? For the kind of average driver, that switch does make sense, even if you have a perfectly good existing petrol car. I do get the kind of psychological component of, like, why would I throw something away that's, like, works, right? I totally get that, but then you do the maths and it doesn't quite work out that way.
Yeah. Okay, yes, your turn, she says reluctantly, only because there's so many wonderful things to discuss. So I think, Lily's got a microphone. Please put your hands up and we'll get come to you after.
Hi, I haven't read the book, but I will. And I just wonder what you have to say about Bill Gates' recent essay, declaration, which one of the things he did say, I've been reading a lot about it, is that part of the function of it is the polarized debate, which certainly is prevalent in the US, but I'm curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so for context, this has generated lots of discussion, like lots of takes. So basically, last week, Bill Gates put out his memo, like his kind of annual memo he often puts out, and I think it was framed like 3 hard truths about the climate or something. And I think the kind of key, some of the challenge there has been that I think people's initial response to it, or in some sense the way it's been portrayed in the media, is actually a bit of at odds with what was actually said in the full entire memo, right? So a key thing he'd said early on is that climate change is a big problem, but it's not an existential threat, right? And by existential, we mean, like, are we all going to be wiped out by climate change? And that's also my take. I don't think it's an existential threat. I think it's a catastrophic threat, and it's a very serious problem. But of course, then all of the headlines is just Bill Gates does a U-turn on climate and says it's not an existential threat, right? So I think that part of it has been that kind of communication and looking for the kind of clickbait message. But then another key part of the memo was he basically said we should not measure climate progress by the temperature level we reach. We should measure it by the kind of human welfare outcomes. And I actually broadly agree with that, in the sense that there are so many different pathways we could take in the future where, let's say we reach 2 degrees, right? There are so many different worlds at 2 degrees, some where we've really failed on improving global human welfare because we haven't invested in education, we haven't invested in health, we haven't invested or tried to promote economic growth in the world's poorest countries. You could have a world at 2 degrees which is really unbelievably catastrophic. You could also have a world at 2 degrees where there are huge impacts from climate change, but actually human welfare at a global level overall is actually higher than it is today. And that's because we invested in resilient crops, we pulled up the people at the bottom, we invested in, so malaria doesn't exist because we have a malaria vaccine. So all of the problems of which climate change compounds, we've put in investments to address other parts of that which have improved things. So that part of it, temperature is an input into that system, and I think in some sense we need to focus on that, but I think we also naturally need to focus on the actual human welfare for outcomes. I would probably extend that and say it's not just about humans, it's also about other ecosystems and other life on the planet as well. I actually think part of, and I can't speak for Bill Gates, so I'm trying kind of extrapolating. I think part of this has been a kind of response to the US's step back on aid this year, where the US is the world's largest aid donor, actually saves millions of lives every year through the aid programs, and therefore, this year has been really dramatic cuts, which will have inevitably cut lives. And I think for someone like Bill Gates, who works in philanthropy and works in global health, probably his foundation has been trying to scramble around, and he's a rich man, but he's actually not rich enough to cover the entire US aid budget for very long. So obviously his foundation are then scrambling around to try and find money for vaccines and other interventions. So I think part of this was also motivated by a kind of political response to the kind of dismantling of aid programs and trying to work out how do we plug the gaps and find funding to save the most lives in this kind of immediate way. But there's definitely been lots of takes and kind of controversy around it.
Hi. Hope feels like an underutilized or overlooked counter-movement to the misinformation ecosystem you mentioned. Could you give examples of how you have quantified hope and perhaps, get more communicators or content creators encouraged to tap into hope so that perhaps more people actually get encouraged to do the right thing?
So I wish I had a quantification of hope. No, I think it's definitely my take, and obviously it comes from my work, is that my kind of framework for change is that a lot of people respond positively to having a sense of agency, that there's stuff we can do, and there is obviously stuff that we can do, and being able to show people that there is momentum there which we can build upon. And I have concerns with the kind of narrative that nothing's happening and our efforts are useless and nothing's going to change. I just don't think that's motivating for people. I should also say that I think humans are complex and we don't all respond to emotions in the same way, right? I think lots of people, and I hear from them every day, like the message I put out and are motivated to get more active and take more action. There are also just some people that just don't respond to the message I put out, and that's fine, right? They might just respond more to fear or anger or whatever emotion is. So I don't think it's like there's one emotion that everyone responds kind of positively to in the same way. But I guess the people that follow my work do respond positively to that. I think a big concern for me has been, especially very recently, especially with the kind of political rhetoric, is that I think across the spectrum is actually not a battle of like hope and doom. Is actually just a battle of like cynicism across the board, and not just on climate. I think on many different issues, there's just this very overwhelming feeling of cynicism, and everything's falling apart, and everything's bad, and we can't do anything right. And I think that does actually lead, not necessarily on climate, but to actually a much more polarized political system. And I think actually leads to people having the sense that everything's going wrong, everything's going backwards. Therefore, we just take a gamble on some political leader that claims that they have the fix to this. So I think, so I don't have the quantification of hope, but I know from the feedback that I get that it works for some people.
And I to add to that point, I think one of the things that brings so much hope throughout the book is the chance of collaboration. I mean, you're talking about politics, but if you use this as a chance for collaboration between countries, trading energy, sharing, I mean, there are so many examples in your book that are so hopeful for what it could do to actually build relationships rather than tear them down.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's true across countries. I also just think that's true, within countries and within particular sectors. Like, there's no certain profession or certain individual for which them taking action is going to solve this. It does require climate scientists to raise the alarm on why we're doing what we're doing and what we need to do. It does take engineers building the solutions. It takes people working in financial institutions to move the money. It does take people in politics to get the right policies in place. It takes kind of the general public to ask for the right stuff. It takes people working in communication to figure out what the best communication strategy. So there's so much room for collaboration across a whole range of, yes, countries, but also sectors. There's just no part of this where someone can say there's just absolutely nothing I can do here or get involved in to help us take a step forward.
Yeah, and also you talk about data, but the reason that people find hope from your work and the things people can do in terms of communications is data plus narrative plus stories plus emotion. I mean, you have to have that part to go with it. You can't just have the cold data really to appeal.
No, so I'm biased because I love data and I'm a data scientist, but I think the research would strongly show that, like, for most people, just throwing some data and information at them, especially if they have a fairly entrenched opinion, is not, in no way is that going to change their mind. What is really effective is this combination of, like, trusted evidence and data combined with a compelling narrative. And I think actually that compelling narrative is something we need to do better on, right? Like, I think if you want to frame it as there being another side, and by the other side I just mean people that think climate change is a hoax or kind of entrenched interests that want to keep us burning fossil fuels forever, I think they've done much better on the narrative, and I think we're not doing so well on the narrative building, right? I think the narrative that has been built is that, taking action on climate or taking action on sustainability inevitably means sacrifice, inevitably means taking a step back, and therefore the message put forward is like, if you want progress to continue, if you want to continue to live your good life, then ignore the climate stuff. Let's keep burning fossil fuels and keep building the system that we currently have. And I think the kind of narrative on the other side has not quite risen to that in some way. I don't think we're good enough at giving a compelling narrative of how world in 2050, where we have made huge progress on climate, is a better world than it is today. I think we're not good at giving people something to be excited about in the future, and I think that's the part that I think we need to do better on.
You are good at it. Yes, this gentleman here.
Hi, thank you. So you mentioned finance and you mentioned narrative. Can you please put those two together for us? What do you think some of the most compelling narratives might be about helping move the large amounts of money above the individual levels that are necessary to really get a lot of these solutions on climate, moving that money in the private sector or also moving it at the governmental level, two different things?
Yeah, I think the important part there is trying to understand the kind of, or get a grasp on the transformation that's happening. And I think most people don't have a grasp on this. We're not just, trying to solve climate change. We're actually undergoing like a pretty huge transformation in the energy system, in the food system, in basically every industry in every sector, whether that's cement or steel or aviation, or there's a huge transformation going on. And I suppose you could sit in the kind of, if you want to frame it as the old world, you can sit in that and do well in that world for a little while, but ultimately the transformation will take hold and you'll be left behind ultimately. So I guess from a kind of financial perspective, it's the question of, do you want to benefit from the kind of old world for a little while, or do you actually want to be part of this huge transformation that's going on? And I think when it comes to the energy transformation that's happening, I think the one mistake we make, especially like actually coming back to the kind of narrative component, is that I think too often we frame it just as a we'll take this coal power and we'll just replace it with solar power, or we'll just replace it with wind power. It's like we're just going to switch this for this, right? And I actually think that hugely understates what it is we're trying to do here. Like, yes, we're switching energy sources to low carbon energy sources, but we're also making huge changes to like how the grid runs and changes in load balances over time, and changes on when people use energy and when they can get cheap energy, and the huge efficiency gains that come from electrification. Like, that's one thing that people, I think, don't get, right? Like, they think an electric car is just like a petrol car but runs on electricity, and that's partly true, but it comes with huge efficiency benefits that I think people don't grasp, right? So, like, driving a mile in an electric car uses a quarter to a third of the energy of driving a mile in a petrol car, right? So if we were to do nothing, no changes in the amount of miles that has been driven, right? Everything stays the same, but we just switch the petrol cars for electric cars, the amount of energy used to power road transport falls by almost 3/4, right? Just with that one switch. And that's just because there's huge efficiency gains that come through electrification. So there's like, my point is that there's a huge transformation going on, which is much more exciting and enticing than just saying, we'll take the coal plant and we'll replace it with some solar panels instead. I think that understates what's actually happening here.
And people don't realise, well, I didn't realise just how much is wasted. Like, the most extraordinary amount of energy when it comes to petrol and to coal and gas is actually just not used, which is you're moving away from. But you can read about that in the book, because it's not my turn for questions. Yes.
Thank you. I get the top-down, bottom-up. I get there's an awful lot of stuff going on. I get that emissions are still going up. They may be plateauing at some point shortly. But if we park all of that, the optimistic part, do we genuinely have optimism on the climate physics? Because we have a saturation of the fast carbon sinks now. So we're getting an acceleration in the rate of rise of atmospheric CO2, whilst emissions are not going up in that same rate. So we're at 4 parts per million per year now. We bust 430.5. Methane emissions are doing the same. We've got 13 positive feedback loops now accelerating emissions just from temperature. And of course, the big one, which you'll be familiar with, is the loss of albedo, so the ability of ice and snow and low altitude cloud to reflect heat back, which has quadrupled our energy gain in the last 4 years to 62 terawatts, which is 13 Hiroshima bombs a second. And that cannot slow down, because ice will continue to melt, even if the temperature were not to rise at all, and we're still going to get those low altitude cloud changes. So we are going to get accelerated heating that's unavoidable, surely, no matter what we do with carbon dioxide. So whilst I am still working like you and fighting like crazy to change the future, have we not got to be realistic about the atmospheric physics?
Yes, we've got to be realistic, which is why I think some of the very, very optimistic scenarios, I think we should just be more open and say, like, obviously this is not going to happen. Like, the notion that we'll stay below 1.5 degrees is just so obviously untrue. And I think as climate scientists, or I don't know if you're a climate scientist, but I think as the kind of climate community, we should stop telling people that, we should be fighting for 1.5 degrees, because it's not going to happen. And that's like the realistic take on this. So like, when it comes to the climate outcomes, there are a couple of inputs, the input into the system is the amount that we're emitting, right? And then the output is dependent on how the climate responds to that, right? But I think the point there is that if you were to look at projections of where we're headed, even being relatively pessimistic on the kind of climate physics part of this, right? We're currently on a trajectory for 2.5 to 3 degrees, right? And that's not fine, and that's not good. But I think with the changes in the inputs, i.e. acceleration of the energy transition, you can bend that 2.5 to 3 degrees to between 2 to 2.5, right? And the kind of optimistic scenario for me is that we basically just about get 2 degrees. That's where I'm saying. And the reason for, and you might think that's not optimistic in any way, but the sense of optimism there comes from the fact that, when I was looking at this 10 years ago, if you'd told me that we had any chance whatsoever of possibly staying anywhere close to 2 degrees, like, I would have laughed. Like, there's absolutely no way I would have believed that it was in any way possible. So I think there is this balance here. I think we should be realistic about this. I think 1.5 degrees is obviously off the table. I think we need to go extremely fast to get anywhere close to 2 degrees. But I think 2 degrees is possibly a stretch goal, even taking into consideration the kind of negative, the accelerated warming, and the kind of negative climate feedbacks. moving relatively quickly on this at a pace that I think is achievable but very ambitious gets us very, very close to 2 degrees. And that's way better than a decade ago when we were talking about probably we'll be at 4 degrees, right? So I agree with you on the balance of that, of the realism and the optimism, but I think that's broadly where we're sitting.
Time for, yeah?
I sort of trying to put this a composite, and I'll try and obviously the work you did on your other book and this one together, and if I sort of try to get it in a way that the way we do or don't solve problems may be relevant, we could do better. Couldn't we do better as human beings? And actually, your opening remark when you said who's for and who's against, that actually is the sort of, there should be 3 alternatives, and that feeds on each other and actually stops us thinking. I'm a therapist, and I work very pragmatically, and I think De Bono says that, he said about the intelligence trap, we always train to get it right or get it wrong, and humanities very much so. And there's a third option, you see, and that all the brilliance in academic work sometimes mix up and the engineers don't. So having 3 options gets you away from that polarity. It gets you away from some of the Manichaean things that's an evil force, as it were, and then begins to open up the possibility of what I call solprums. So when you think, instead of calling it a problem, say, as I say it, is there? And that, I think that's something you want to do. And then also, then you're opened up and you're beginning to see that statistics are interesting, and it helps you to get a better knowledge for a solve, including the fact we're all dead and how do we prepare for a good end. That's not also me, but that's part of being a human being and being grown up. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the way I make pragmatically. So I think that attitude, I think Kahneman's book and all these things and Nudge are very important. And it is very possible for and then I think the most important thing, we get mad hat ideas. And that could be dangerous. World wars are caused by this sort of things, and goodness knows what. So for me, it makes common sense because I'm sort of a down-to-earth psychiatrist, but it works. Thank you. Sorry, I don't know that's...
Thank you.
Clear.
Might have time for. Can I actually, just because of that mad hat ideas, there is a really interesting part of the book where you sort of do entertain the mad hat ideas that this could be saved by some extraordinary. Is it sort of
solar geoengineering?
Yeah. Do you want to just very quickly touch on why we shouldn't perhaps entertain that madcap idea, or possibly should?
Yeah, to be clear, like, I don't say that we should just go for the mad hat solution, no. But I do get asked this question a lot of, like, can we not just kill the planet and that will be fixed, right? And the answer there is that from a kind of technical feasibility angle, yeah, we know actually how to kill the planet. Like, there are things that we could do to geoengineer and kill the planet. And actually, some of those techniques are actually very cheap. The issue there is that they seem cheap if we do it and we just assume that everything goes well. They could also be extremely expensive if we don't know what we're doing, and these are complex systems, and we mess up really badly. And often with these techniques, the issue is that once you start, you can't stop, right? Or if you do stop, there's a very, very dramatic kind of negative impact in the other direction. So my take on it is not that we should be deploying these solutions, but I do think that we should be putting some investment into research and understanding these methods, what the impacts would be, trying to predict, like, to a high resolution what the outcome might be. And one of the key reasons for that is that I think because you can actually do this stuff relatively cheaply, I think it seems to me not totally off the table that at some point some country will just decide to do this, right? I think some country at some point could just hit the point where they say, no, we've had enough of the warming, we're going to try and sort it out. And because of the cost, they could, like, a reasonably big country could do this on their own. And if that's the stakes, then I would like us to understand what the repercussions and impacts of that would be. So I'm in a kind of, my perspective is like, no, we should not be deploying this stuff, but I think to say that we should not be kind of researching this whatsoever, I think is also concerning.
I'm sort of read that chapter very surprised that someone in Hollywood has not made that film yet of somebody pressing that button, but maybe they're making it. We might have time for one very quick last, yeah.
Hey, I don't know if you've read Ministry for the Future, and no spoilers because I haven't finished it yet, but in that book, India does exactly that after experiencing a catastrophic heat wave, and it's interesting to follow it and see where it ends, but as I say, no spoilers. I speak to young people every week, twice a week, who are suffering with a really bad case of climate anxiety. Is there sort of one message that you would have me pass on to them that would help give them a bit of hope and optimism?
Yeah.
Great question. It was like we planted you there for the last question, but we didn't.
I mean, I get this a lot as well, and I hear from a lot of young people, and it's hard to convey how bad and in a whole these young people feel. Like, I do genuinely get young people emailing me who are actually suicidal and don't see any future, and I think that's like incredibly sad, and often I feel under pressure in some way to help, right? Like, and I'm not a trained therapist, and I think that's actually very common for climate scientists to get this, and we're not trained to be able to deal with people that are in that place. I think what's really key for this is not lying to young people and pretending this is not an issue or it's all going to be fine, because that's unrealistic and it's untrue, right? But I think what's really key is conveying this sense of, yes, this is a problem, but there are things that we can do about it, and people are genuinely doing stuff about this, and the kind of adults in the room are not doing as much as we would hope, but there are lots of adults in the room that are really trying to move things forward, and are making progress on that. So I think it is this sense of not lying and pretending it's a non-issue, but giving young people a sense that, you know, things can change and things are happening. I quite dislike sometimes often it comes across, or people think the right approach is to like somehow put the responsibility on young people, right? Like, well, you can grow up and you can contribute to the solutions to this. And I think that's unfair. Like, I think as adults in the room know, like, maybe we should not wait on the kids to grow up and they can do the job for us. So I don't like that particular like messaging, but I think it is this mix of kind of truth and reality, but also this sense of agency that there are things that can be done. And again, focusing on the fact that I think people have the sense, especially young people, that because of climate change, the future will inevitably be worse. And, you know, if it's not complete extinction, what we're fighting for is how bad it's going to be. And I think that's not the only realistic scenario here. Like, there is a realistic scenario where the future for young people is actually better than it is today. And it will take effort to get there, but like, for me, that's absolutely worth aiming for.
I mean, that's definitely the sense that I think you leave your readers with. I'm not surprised you get lots of emails. I feel like people just, every time there's a question, just ask Hannah, just ask you anything. And this wonderful, as I said at the beginning, just, you know, facts just to come back. Sadly, we don't have any more time to ask you any more questions, but you can get the book. Are you going to sign a couple of copies? Brilliant. Hannah will be signing it. So thank you all for excellent questions. Thanks for ending on such a good one as well. And Hannah, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks.